the DHS has put forward their new periodic terror alert report, giving us an inside look at what they're concerned about, which groups might be being targeted, what plots have recently been unveiled. And in the most recent report, which came out just yesterday, they spotlighted particular new threats to the LGBTQ, Jewish, and migrant communities coming from violent extremists inside of the United States. And we're gonna dive into all of those, but understand that like the top line thing is it continues to be noteworthy, not only because of the threat posed, but also by the fact that we don't really talk about it at a national level, that the terror concerns are not what they were a decade or 2 decades ago. This is not about people from outside of the country coming in and just trying to kill any Americans that they can. These are homegrown domestic terrorists being radicalized by actors inside of the United States and then thrown at different communities. And so they spotlight in this report that Americans motivated by violent ideologies pose a persistent and lethal threat. Intelligence officials across the federal government have consistently highlighted the growing threat of American extremists in recent years, explaining, as I pointed out, that foreign threats such as ISIS or Al Qaeda are no longer as persistent as they once were. And so they talk about some of the recent violence that we've seen and talked about on the damage report, including the shooting at the LGBTQ bar in Colorado Springs. The report also highlighted an enduring threat to the Jewish community. And one of the representatives that put together this report was asked about some of the recent anti-Semitism that we've seen at a very high level, including from Kanye West, the dinner with Donald Trump, which was referenced in that video. And they said that certainly the Jewish community seems particularly targeted in recent days by that kind of activity in our discourse. But let's be clear, there have been many threats against synagogues, in particular Jewish community centers, for literally years now, and successful instances of terrorism targeting that community both inside and outside of the United States. So this is a continuing threat, and the rhetoric around it is very high profile right now, but it is not by any means a new threat. Miranda, I know we're covering a lot of ground here, but what do you think?
Absolutely. So there are threats against certain members of this community. I bet you can't guess who. See, the violence has been on the rise, like you said, for the past few years, so much that me, as a member of the LGBTQ community, I didn't feel a shock to this. It was just kind of like a, yep, everyone batten down the hatches, everyone brace for impact, because it's just, we've become so desensitized to it because it's just so tragically common these days for groups like communities like mine and communities like these to be constantly threatened. And now we're at a point where it's a terrorist threat. We have domestic terrorist threats against our own community. I was in Scotland abroad for studying last year. And when I was making travel plans back and forth for the holidays and such, they have alerts to their citizens against visiting the US saying, enter at your own risk, basically, because it is a current state of political and social turmoil, and it is a dangerous place to visit, especially if you are a person of color or a member of the LGBTQ community. There are multiple countries having alerts for their citizens like that not to visit the US. That is where we are at in our country right now. We have domestic terrorist threats against our own people. And I don't even like going to large public events, whether they're LGBTQ events or whether they're just a general large public event, because I'm legitimately afraid that I'm going to be attacked. And that is not the kind of society that we should be living in. And it's no surprise when you look at our leadership or high profile people like Kanye West, and there's rampant anti-Semitism. There are people like Marjorie Taylor Greene comparing the Holocaust to having to wear masks on the floor.
Yeah.
I mean, when you have things like that happening, people look to leadership and they follow the behavior and the thought process of people in leadership positions. So it's no surprise that the violence is on the rise.
Yeah, 100%. And look, it's bad enough that there's the sort of content and media out there that radicalizes people to act on these hatreds and fears and all that. But then the new layer on top of that we saw after the Club Q shooting was that there wasn't even a brief distancing after the violence from those actors who've been spreading this hatred. Many of them just going to social media to say, what do you expect? You guys are groomers, like we said, so some of you maybe have to get shot up or whatever. They feel completely emboldened to push for more and more violence like this. And even seeing it in front, seeing the children's hospitals, bomb threats against them, that does not buy one day of them backing off of their encouragement to stochastic terrorism, unfortunately.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.